insofar as they're relevant to answer the question. So it's not so much the content or the amount of material about the passage, it's the analysis. Okay? So the way, the ideas, the specifics of how you think about the passage and how you organize that material, and again, don't stay at the level of generalities, really stick to trying to analyze the quote and make your comments about that. So if you apply yourself to that and have confidence in your own abilities, right? One of the places where undergraduates fall is just a question of a lack of confidence, right, in their own abilities of analysis. And so people lack confidence in their own abilities of analysis, so they start to rely on secondary sources, citing them properly, or stick to things that are, they feel are safe. What I'm suggesting is just have confidence in your ability to analyze and your competency in theory, and have fun with the exercise. Okay, so just to continue on then with Confucius, last week we provided an introduction to Confucianism, which we also called, or is called, the family system. This is just an overview then on the points that we'll be looking at today, and in the recap from last week, looking at the nature of citizenship for Confucius, as well as the nature of governance, and then looking at a few of these questions and positions that talk about ways in which we can think about the significance for Confucianism, both in terms of development within China, but secondly, in terms of sort of dialogue, I guess you might say, with Plato and Aristotle. Okay, so just as a recap to put you back into that space, why is Confucianism called a family system? Well, we saw through the quotes, there's the general notion with Confucius that the root of virtue is in the household. The root being the place where virtue starts, the place that can be independent of all other manifestations of virtue. If the root can survive even in water when the rest of the plant does not survive. And we saw some of the parameters of the Confucian practice of self-cultivation. Cultivation of the self, living up to the standard of the gentleman that Trump do. Now, we saw that this model of the exemplary individual in Confucius differs from Plato and Aristotle in part insofar as this cultivated individual to Confucius is a living model. Right? One looks at the best examples of human behavior in one's horizon rather than in an ideal realm or in the text of political theory. That's probably the only place to find a common philosophy. And because part of the matter and content of virtue is to be very aware of one's role in that local setting, in that group, in the family, and to perform that role well. So one measure of moral virtue for Confucius is the quality of the social relationships that one has, and one has to be on the lookout for the effects of one's behavior on others. So as we said last week, maintaining a number of social relations in the appropriate sphere can be seen to be always a sufficient condition for virtue in the Confucian sense, something impossible for both Plato and Aristotle because of the constant external standard to which that Greek ideal appealed. So the broad parameters of the practice of virtue include seeking to practice the qualities of benevolence or humaneness, as your translation calls it, Ren or Jen, which involve a minimum the minimum, was never imposing on others that which you would not wish to have imposed upon yourself. A sort of negative expression or articulation of what in Western traditions we sometimes call the golden rule, and do unto others. Related to this was using words of caution and always seeking to be honest in speech. Focus your practice of virtue first with those closest to you in the household, demonstrating the goodness of filial piety as exemplified through the performance of the rites, right, the duty, that again one of those central concepts in Confucianism. And this then serves as a basis for extending correct behavior out into other forums. It means that the hierarchy that is naturally a part of the family is extended into social expectations and behavior. The rites that one performs to honor one's ancestors and elders are extended into practices of ritual respect for others and traditional authority. So it sanctifies social relations in some ways, or it acknowledges social relations as sacred, but at the same time sanctifies them too. Social relations are approached with a strong degree of reverence when they seek to play one's role in the social order with a strong sense of honor, a self driven by the need to live up to expectations dictated by the social role that one occupies. So in a Confucian spirit, I, as a teacher, would not look to the form of wisdom or even to the Platonic philosopher, nor even to Socrates, but to the first teacher, Confucius, and seek to emulate him as best I could. Now, something that jumps out at me in considering this comparison is that while in the Platonic model, the pursuit of wisdom is followed even at the cost of angering and alienating others. So you think of Socrates' interactions with Lysimachus, for example, in the Republic. So there's a sense in which the philosopher, doesn't really, the Platonic philosopher may not that Socrates necessarily lived up fully to that ideal, but nonetheless, the practice of philosophy in that Platonic sense, in some ways, followed on the legacy of Socrates. It's the idea of the philosopher as an irritant in the way of teaching. In some ways, Socrates is always well known as the gadfly, right? That thing that, when you go up to the forest in Bay, the little, how annoying, right, flies can be. And that was sort of a model of philosophy, someone who's always sort of biting at you and trying to have you shake you out of your presuppositions, which is very different, right, from the Confucian model as a teacher. You think of Confucius as the exemplary teacher, which generally he is within the Confucian tradition. Rather than, the primacy of wisdom for its own sanction at all costs, one sees in the Confucian model concerns for students coming out as primary. And it's through a concern for students then that one begins to be led to wisdom rather than just wisdom for its own sake. So it's the distinction between the philosopher and the teacher, which, at one level seems perhaps only semantic, but at another level demonstrating quite distinct approaches to the pursuit of wisdom. Okay, so let's then try to extrapolate some of these notions into more of a public consequences, public circumstances. So you can see in the first part here, I'm going to talk about Confucian as a citizen, and then think about Confucian in the role as ruler. Confucianism as a philosophy helping to understand the process of government. So first of all, Confucian citizenship, or the good citizen as the cultivated individual. Now, we first have to acknowledge that, of course, Confucius does not speak of citizens, but of subjects. Obviously, given his context, failed states to contend with. But in addition, right, this understanding of subjects perhaps also provides an expression of the importance of obedience to a moral framework. So why should we talk about citizenship at all, right, within the context of Confucianism? Well, the reason why we still might think about some idea of citizenship in Confucius, despite his avoidance of the term citizen, is because there is some ethos of public service, right, in Confucianism. Not invoked by the term citizen, but nonetheless a notion of service that is there, and it can be conceived in a couple of ways. So the question for us will be the degree to which any formal politics is necessary for living out the Confucian ideal. Right? We can say that for Confucius, man is a social animal, but maybe ask the question, is man really a political animal in that Aristotelian sense? Because one of the first points we could start at acknowledging is that for Confucius, the good citizen is the gentleman, right, or the good man. There's no question, right, you remember that passage in Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics, where he's talking about, well, what is the relationship between the good citizen and the good man? And Aristotle says, well, actually, they're for the most part different, right, except in the good regime where the good man is ruling, and then they will be both citizen of that regime and a good man. Whereas it would seem to me that in Confucius, right, to be a good citizen just means to be a good man. And this is supported by this quote here, Book 2, Section 21. Someone said to Master Tong, "Why do you not take part in government?" The master said, "The book of documents mentions filial piety, doesn't it? Only be dutiful towards your parents and friendly towards your brothers, and you will be contributing to the existence of government. These virtues surely constitute taking part in government, so why should only that particular activity be regarded as taking part in government?" So we could look at this perhaps from the point of view of a more postmodern theorist and extrapolate from that this idea of governmentality that is sort of infused through our family practices. Public service, governmentality is a word taken from Foucault, in which it's meant as sort of a critical account of the way in which the state and service to the order tends to hijack us and lead us into ways of behaving that, in some ways, restrict us, right? But I'm appropriating the Foucauldian term of governmentality and suggesting using it a little bit much more benignly, less critically than Foucault does. But it does nonetheless tie into this idea that in practices which technically are outside of government and public life, there is this continuity between public service in the family and that public life. What's interesting here, then, is that we have a notion of justice that is rooted in the family. So I wanted to just develop this reflection a little bit more, because there are a lot of accounts in contemporary liberal theory that tend to discount or even ignore the family in theories of justice. And why? Well, if we take someone like John Rawls, someone who's perhaps the most preeminent modern theorist of justice, at least from the 20th century account, in one early article on the development of the sense of justice, Rawls suggests that the early manifestations of moral feeling in the family are not truly moral examples because they rely on known social circles. Right? So the objection to developing a theory of justice and rooting it in the family is precisely the fact that because we know our family members and because they're so close to us and so tied in with our own self-interest, that we couldn't possibly develop a good understanding of justice through those types of close relations to us. In other words, Rawls felt that an understanding of justice that was derived or modeled on the relationships that we had with others close to us in the family could lead to corruption, because it was based on respect for age, respect for parental authority above merit, that led to prioritizing of family ties over others, promoted the values of loyalty and honor over those of procedural fairness and hard work. So in contrast then to this idea of a justice being rooted in some conception of the family, we have theorists like Rawls who develop an idea that arguably would go right back to Plato, that a true sense of justice can only be manifested when you demonstrate an attachment to people with whom you've had no previous attachment or affiliation. In other words, a sort of contrasting or competing conception of justice is one that is linked to notions of impartiality and neutrality. Okay? So what I'm trying to suggest then is we have this Confucian understanding of justice that's rooted in loyalty, family ties, closeness, affection, all those sorts of things. And then we have this competing sense of justice often associated with liberal democracy that is linked to notions of impartiality and neutrality. And of course, this notion of justice as impartiality and neutrality has implications for a wide set of practices in our own society. On the functional side, right, we have the image of justice blindfold, right? Justice shouldn't know who the parties are involved, justice decides on the merits of the case. And there are all sorts of ways in which this notion of justice as neutrality comes into play. But there's also many ways in which it works in certain perverse ways as well in our own practices. So, for example, arguably these are ways in which a notion of treating, not recognizing the specificity of situations can lead to some perverse results. So, for example, in job classes, in job, or at least in regimes which look over health plans for employees, sometimes maternity is classified with other afflictions of the body like disability and sickness. The idea is you can't get special treatment for women for maternity, so maternity is treated like having a cold or having a long-term disability in some employment plans, right? And that's sort of because of this idea that you be neutral, you don't recognize gender and that condition for women specifically. Or you could argue that in the case of the Charter of Values of Quebec, again, right, there's this invocation of neutrality, that the public sphere has to remain neutral to all questions of religion, thereby banning all sorts of religious headgear and clothing in the public sphere, which of course has led to an outcry from not just minorities, but defenders of inclusive Quebec and defenders of multiculturalism in Quebec, because it's felt that so-called impartiality and neutrality is in fact a violation of rights. And in a funny sort of way as well, I don't know if you heard last week, but there was a verdict in a courtroom in Toronto when a judge was making the decision about an anesthesiologist who, it's a horrible case, right? Who sexually assaulted 21 women while they were under anesthesia in the operating room. And they were sort of conscious, but they couldn't move, right, because they were drugged. And so when this person became convicted and the judge announced his decision, he said, there will be no expressions of emotion in the courtroom, which, is sort of, you can understand the logic, right? It's justice is neutral, and we sort of put a public space. We want to present this as a judgment based in reason and not emotion and so on. But on the other hand, right, if you're one of the victims of this person, then clearly, why not the emotion in the courtroom? Okay? So again, this notion that you can't express emotion in the courtroom is what I would argue, anyway, a sort of another perversity of a doctrine of state neutrality. So these dysfunctional examples I picked for a reason, and that's to demonstrate both the idea and practice of state neutrality and impartiality is more problematic than generally acknowledged. And that such terms can be used to bolster and legitimate practices and policies that may in fact appear to undermine justice and not further it. Although, as an aside, if some of you don't know Rawls from reading political theory and philosophy and knowing about John Rawls, some of you may know about Rawls by having watched the 50th anniversary show of Doctor Who over the weekend, which I didn't see myself, but apparently there was a classic Rawlsian scenario where the humans of the zygotes, right, had to somehow make peace, and they had to stand behind this sort of what Rawls would call a veil of ignorance, right? They had to forget and not know who they would be in a future world and then decide on how that world would be organized, given the lack of ignorance of what would happen. That's right out of Rawls' theory of justice, and again is based on this notion of justice as impartiality, that you come up with the best just solution with not knowing your particular situation in that society, but thinking through things in a very abstract way. Okay. So, but to talk about these, what I call sort of perversities or odd ways in which some applications of a doctrine of neutrality become dysfunctional, all of that is to say that the Confucian notion, to some degree, may not be so crazy as it might first appear. Let's look and see then, in a bit more detail, what might the merits of a family derived idea of justice, which is something I think is very much in tension with how we tend to conceptualize justice in different contexts. Well, first of all, arguably, the ignorance of the domestic sphere and broader conceptions of justice has blinded us to the ways that justice should be applied in the family. This is a classic line that was made by Susan Mulder-Okin in the 1980s, that basically by suggesting that justice is a public doctrine in Western liberal democracies, we had tended to think that justice was not relevant to family life. That has been changing, obviously, but clearly, if Confucianism roots justice in the family, that you